welcome to Chapter 4, the primary application, also formerly known as AMCAS for allopathic, also known as MD medical students and medical school applicants. The alternative to the primary application for osteopathic is AACOMAS, but we will be discussing more of that in future chapters. So this chapter primarily focuses on just the allopathic version of AMCAS. I recommend that a lot of students who are watching this video right now, they watch the entire, Chapter 4 section before even considering applying to medical school. You don't have to necessarily pay attention to all of the little nitty-gritty details of filling out the application itself, but getting a good idea of, what goes into a medical school application, what creates a strong applicant, I think is going to be very important to reinforce these principles now so that when you are applying in the future, you've already taken care of the business and you've already set yourself up to then put all of that information in. And you'll understand more about what I'm talking about in future lectures. When filling out the primary application, I highly, highly, highly recommend you take a look at the most recent cycle's AMCAS applicant guide. And you can see that right here. So this is the 2023 version of it, and they come out with one every single year for every single cycle. It's not to say that the 2022 is dramatically different, but they do update things as they go. So I'm not actually linking anything in this particular slide just because, like I said, they do update this every single year. So it's just, this will probably become outdated by the time someone, is viewing this down the road. So with that in mind, it's like a 95 to 100 page document that describes the single little step of the AMCAS process. Part of this course is kind of helping you guys sift through all of that information, provide the pharmacy perspective to it, and kind of save yourself some time. Now, at any point, if there's something that is, you have more questions about, or you're not quite sure what I'm talking about at that particular instance, I want you to refer back to this guide and go to that particular section, because a lot of this information is pulled from there, but also through my personal experiences and through other research online from other people. If there's any option or issues where you need to kind of like check the rule book, this is where you want to go, okay? Additionally, we've mentioned this prior, but rolling admissions and getting your application in at a reasonable time is super important to getting into medical school. When I say rolling admissions, if you haven't been watching any previous videos, this refers to basically a first come, first served basis, in the sense that medical schools only have a finite number of interviews and obviously a finite number of acceptance spots. And so because of that, it's kind of a first come, first serve. Whatever application is in front of them and whoever's in that stack of applications is going to get reviewed prior to maybe someone who submits their information a month later. And so they might offer a certain amount of interviews during that first cycle because everyone was so good and they couldn't really disqualify people. So there might just be less and less applications less and less seats further down the line for interviews because all of them went to people who had similar stats to you but just got into the application pile first. So I really want to harp on that because it is super important that you try to maintain a good schedule. So when you're submitting your AMCAS application, and I'll have to double check some of these dates, but they kind of wax and wane every year. But generally speaking, AMCAS, the application service, opens in May, like the 1st of May or a few days after that. And it becomes available for you to input your information. You can't do anything beyond just put the information in and kind of queue up the application, make sure all your punctuation is in and you've kind of transferred in your transcripts and stuff along those lines. Then in June is when you can actually formally submit the application. And so when you formally submit the application, it enters a verification queue, as you can see here, AMCAS verification. So when the verification, the primary purpose of this is to make sure the application has been filled out appropriately, all the courses have been effectively assigned and they're not miscalculating GPAs and all of that stuff. And this might seem like a lot of information up front, so don't worry, we'll kind of dive into it a little bit further. But I just want you to understand the basic timeline of things. So it enters the verification queue. someone at AMCAS is going to look at your whole application and make sure it's filled out appropriately and correctly. If there's issues, they'll send it back to you, or they'll make corrections as needed. So obviously you want to make sure you avoid that by filling it out appropriately, because sending back for corrections or making changes can cause delays. And like we said, delays are bad for rolling admissions. So also, by the time you enter a verification queue, the earlier you submit your information into the verification queue, the faster it's going to get pushed through. And once it kind of gets that stamp of approval, it enters basically a ready to send queue. And for all intents and purposes, that basically means that it will sit there ready to go off to medical schools. Now, based off of the AMCAS rules, primary applications aren't allowed to be sent until July 1st and maybe give or take a few days. And that's when, so after July 1st, all of those applications that have passed the verification process are then automatically dispersed out to the medical schools of your choosing that you designated on your AMCAS. So to kind of recap all of that, application opens in May, you fill it all out. Then June 1st, you can submit, and then it enters verification queue. Verification can be, depending on how quickly you get it in, can last anywhere from 10 days to up to 6 weeks at peak period times. So the benefit of getting in on that June 1st day is I can't stress that enough. Now, let's say you're a few days late. It's not going to dramatically change the overall cycle, but that's something to just be aware of. And then July 1st is when all of the applications get sent out to medical schools, and that's when you begin to be eligible for secondary applications that come through. So once a medical school kind of gets that immediate push, like, oh, we got an application from this applicant here, then we can automatically send them a secondary application, which they'll then fill out and then kind of further along the process with the medical school itself. So I hope all of that makes sense. So I've stressed this before, but pre-writing your content is super important, because that can allow you to fill in your AMCAS at a faster rate. So having all that content already pre-written that you can just copy and paste it in, make a few adjustments, final rereading, and then hit submit can really help with the process itself. So that is kind of the introduction for how these things work, and then we'll kind of dig into the details a little bit further. So to further reinforce the point of rolling admissions, you can kind of take a look at these 3 different student examples I've set up here. So, for instance, student A correlates, the white text here correlates with this column here, yellow to yellow, and then C to C. So you can read through it right here, but basically student A is pretty diligent and proactive about their application course. And so you can kind of read through, it takes the verification process 2 weeks, that's about average. They are then sent out with the first group of students when they submit, and they receive the onslaught of secondary applications in which they're proactive about and they complete pretty quickly. So at the time they finish all their secondary applications, they've already done their CASPER, because I recommended you take care of that, even prior to AMCAS opening, and they've done all the additional criteria. They basically have their application fully complete and sitting in a reviewer, a medical school AdCom, like my former self, has their application perfect and ready to go, and it's ready for review. And that's when then that individual who's reviewing the content can then say yes or no, interview, wait list, and so on. And so the sooner you have access to that opportunity to be reviewed, the sooner you have the chance of basically taking one of those coveted interview slots. So you can see here, student B, they were a little more casual with their approach. Their verification took 4 weeks, which is about how long mine actually took. So I'm more of a student B when it came to how my cycle worked. Part of the reason was because my MCAT ended up taking a little bit longer to take when I took it in that P3 year. I took it because I had to kind of navigate pharmacy finals, so I ended up taking my MCAT after the pharmacy finals, but then it takes a whole month for the MCAT to actually, the score report to actually be published. So, long story short, I was more of a student B. Now, it didn't necessarily impact my my overall outcome, but it definitely put me a little bit further behind the pack when it came to, I guess, when the interviews were being offered. Like, I was seeing online that people were already saving interviews, and I hadn't even finished or received the secondary at that point in time, from particular medical schools. Other schools I had gotten secondaries and so on. So that's just something I wanted to introduce there. And then, as you can see, student C, this is the late individual who didn't submit their application till July. This is like the peak time because everyone's just cramming to get their application in. They're like the last minute. They want to make sure they get it in. And so verification can, like I said, take as long as 6 whole weeks. So that's 6 weeks where it's just sitting in a queue at AMCAS headquarters where all these other people are getting interviews and attending the interviews even at that point, and might even have an acceptance depending on where they're at in the cycle, and you're still sitting in the verification queue, not even touching a secondary at that point in time. So you can kind of contrast the different, the stress associated with each one of these situations, and you can kind of go from there. But that concludes kind of the introduction of the primary application.